also the director of our project on the future of free speech. And we have the great pleasure of presenting a world-class panel today on global attitudes to free speech and online free expression in collaboration with Google, who is a sponsor of this event. As I mentioned, we have a world-class panel. I'll get back to introducing our panelists briefly. After my short introduction, each of our panelists will then speak around 7 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion for everyone to be able to ask questions, and we'll throw them out there to the panelists. For many reasons, this panel is very timely. Some of them quite sad, because the future of online free speech is very much in the news, but also under pressure, I think we can say, both in traditional democracies, but certainly also in authoritarian states. One only has to look at the conflict, the invasion of Ukraine, and see that in addition to innocent people being killed, online free speech is a victim as well, with draconian crackdowns in Russia, but also a crackdown in the European Union, with attempts to shut down Russian disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation, with consequences for online free speech here. At the same time, we're at the European Union, the Digital Services Act, DSA, draft has been approved and is subject of ongoing negotiations, which will have potentially a huge impact, not only on the future of online free speech in Europe, but also worldwide. That at least is the ambition of the European Union, to set the gold standard for the regulation of online speech. So the stakes are very high. I'm right now sitting in London, and I believe the online safety bill is about to be introduced, maybe even today, which also brings up a lot of questions and impacts online free speech in many ways. And all this at a time where online free speech has been in global decline for more than a decade, as per Freedom House's rankings, and with stories coming from around the world every day of governments getting creative on how to censor and filter the information that citizens can reach. And of course, there are many angles on this. One of them is, what should be the standards used to measure this? Should it be international human rights law? In which case, should it be European human rights law? Should it be United Nations human rights law? And do those offer differing standards when it comes to free speech? Another angle that we have tried to look at Justitia is, the problem of how people around the world look at free speech. Because when you ask people around the world whether they think free speech is a good thing, almost everyone says yes. So we did this survey back in 2021, and the vast majority of people in the world say that free speech is very important. But when you ask people whether free speech should also protect content that is religiously offensive or offensive to minorities, we see huge differences around the globe. And that, of course, makes it extremely difficult to make global standards for global platforms, for a global internet. No matter where we draw the line, some people are going to think that the line is drawn in the wrong place, and some people are going to feel left out, whereas others think that too much is being left up. I think, and I'd be keen to hear our panelists' view on this. I think that the overall direction, though, tends to be that the pressure overwhelmingly is to remove more stuff, rather than to let more stuff being kept up, and so the net movement is probably one that undermines rather than strengthens free speech from a regulatory point of view. But yeah, so as you can see, the way that I framed it, these are big and huge questions. But luckily, we have gathered an outstanding panel who will solve all these complicated issues today, and we can come up with an alternative to the DSA, and that can be the gold standard, perhaps. Or even if we don't quite manage that, we can still make a contribution. But please allow me to introduce our panel. Agapi Patsa from Google, Joan Barata from Stanford's Policy Center, Nighat from the Digital Rights Foundation, Nilay Erdem from Meta, Rikke Jørgensen from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and Professor Tarlach McGonagle from the University of Amsterdam. So we have a panel that has industry, activists, academics, everything. I would like to give the floor initially to Agapi to give us your views on how you see this moment we're standing in right now. How should we look at online free speech? What should we be worried about? What are some of the hopeful things that when it comes to safeguarding online free speech? So Agapi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And thank you for the opportunity to share insights on this very complex but important topic. So my name is Agapi, and I'm legal counsel for EU regulatory affairs at Google. So a large chunk of my work relates to EU-level content moderation legislation, and in particular, the Digital Services Act. And I will focus a lot of my remarks on that today, given that's a key piece of legislation that will redefine the way we approach content moderation at an EU level. I have gone through the global survey that Justitia ran with great interest, and I would like to make 3 remarks to begin with. Looking forward to hearing what others drew from the survey also. My first remark is that one size does not fit all. And I appreciate that the survey really focused on content moderation on social media, but I do feel that to begin, we need to take a step back and acknowledge that what is perceived as acceptable content moderation on one service might not be acceptable on another service. And in my mind, even the term social media can be unclear. So I suppose the core point here is that any piece of regulation should recognize the differences between digital services. The Digital Services Act, which is now being finalized, as Jacob said, at the EU level by the co-legislators, does this by creating a graduated regulatory framework. For example, under the most recent text we've seen, search engines are not hosting services. That was not a given to begin with. The first text we saw in the Digital Services Act did not make the distinction very clearly, and that was very concerning. Why? Because search engines are essentially a mirror of the entire web. And in being such a mirror, they play a unique, a very important role in facilitating access to information that is available online. So if we were to place restrictions on the types of content that can be accessed by users through search engines, we would essentially run counter to the very ideals of democracy, of an open society. We would interfere with the people's ability to access and hear different views, as well as share their own. For this reason, content moderation when it comes to search engines, in my view, should remain narrowly focused on compliance with valid requests for the restriction of what is clearly illegal content. It should also focus on transparency measures around content policies. And that is because search engines are not really hosts of content the same way as other services are. So they do not host the content that appears in the results. They do not store the information other than in a very temporary manner, much like caching services, some would say. And so they don't have the same ability as hosting services such as YouTube or Facebook, for example, to remove content from the web, because even if we ask a search engine to remove links to web pages from their index, actually those web pages are still available. They're just not in the index of that particular search engine. Now, the most recent text of the Digital Services Act also recognizes differences between hosting services themselves, because I think we should also appreciate that not all hosting services are the same, right? We have hosting services that allow for very wide dissemination of user-generated content, and these should not be treated similarly with other hosting services that allow for personal storage of content, cloud services used for personal storage, or even interpersonal communication services, such as email or instant messaging apps, where content might be shared within very small circles of users and where we have very significant privacy considerations to consider. So all these differences need to be taken into account when we talk about content moderation and when we try to strike the right balance between freedom of expression and actually protecting users from online harms. My second remark is that the regulation of lawful but harmful content needs to be approached with great caution. And this is a theme that we see coming up in all recent content moderation laws. The effort by legislators to protect users from content that is not illegal per se, but somehow, according to policymakers, could harm users or particular categories of users. Now, the problem here is that what is harmful content, you can think of disinformation, is highly subjective and it's very context dependent. And this makes it very difficult to establish a clear definition that would be appropriate across different kinds of services, different kinds of jurisdictions, different kinds of contexts. So a very strict legal obligation to remove or significantly restrict that kind of content would create legal uncertainty that could eventually lead many service operators to reduce the availability of user-generated content, therefore undermining freedom of expression at large. Now, this said, there is definitely a need to respond to what are legitimate concerns around the risks posed by lawful but harmful content. And to the extent that we see many new regulations developed to address such content, the question is, what is the right approach? So in our view, the right approach is one of transparency and accountability. Requirements on service providers to put in place clear, accessible, easily understandable policies around what is an acceptable use of their services, processes to inform the services about misuse, contrary to those internal policies, and also appeals mechanisms for decisions taken on such misuse. Right. We also believe that there should be evaluation mechanisms, regulatory oversight for consistent enforcement of the stated policies, of the measures taken to address those risks at a systemic level. And that is a very important point I want to stress, and I think we should also discuss it later on. The standard of systemic failure, essentially, to address certain risks, to abide by certain internal policies the operator set, should be clearly defined, and it should take into account the scale, the complexity at which platforms operate, the overall success rate at addressing specific problematic content, and the risks to legitimate speech, actually, from what could be precipitous action. This approach would push platforms to develop what is thoughtful content moderation policies that are appropriate to the platform size, the platform's nature, audience, under systemic regulatory oversight. So we caution against oversight and penalties over individual content failures, essentially, when it comes to harmful content. And even the Digital Services Act is actually taking a similar approach to what I just described, but it does open the door to some risks, depending on how some of its rather open-ended and abstract requirements might be interpreted in practice later on. For example, there is this provision around risk mitigation measures that could cover lawful but harmful content. And you could see an outcome where a regulator actually imposes strict turnaround times to remove disinformation, or filtering obligations under those risk mitigation measures that are very open-ending. So that would have, in our view, an adverse impact on freedom of speech, and it's something that should be monitored and assessed throughout the application of the Digital Services Act. And I will just close by making a very succinct remark, which is that whatever we do in Europe will actually have an impact on the rest of the world, very much like the comments I saw in the survey around the impact of German NetzDG. So the Digital Services Act will be used as a blueprint for content moderation laws worldwide. And this is going to happen because the open nature of the internet makes online content regulation an inherently global issue. So we think that Europe definitely has a responsibility to strike the right balance here due to how it might influence the rest of the world and how it approaches content moderation online. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing others' views and engaging in the Q&A later on.
Just before I let you go, Agapi, maybe you could very briefly just, I think there's been, at least from my point of view, some confusion about the extent of the obligations of the recent EU regulation on countering Russian disinformation. And it seemed that the Commission more or less asked you and others to also disable from search engine returning results that could include Russian disinformation like Russia Today and Sputnik. Can you confirm that and just the scope of it just very briefly, because I think it's really interesting in the terms of what the future might look like. If this is an instrument being adopted now, it might be sort of a harbinger of what could be inspected in the future.
Yeah, so that was not, there was indeed a request to remove, to de-index from search engines links to specific, not even to specific, to some service providers, not specific domains. That was not under the DSA, I want to flag that. It was under the sanctions that were adopted by, under the CFSP framework. Personally, I went through the text with other colleagues, with outside counsel. The text of the sanctions was very badly written, very quickly adopted, and even the language versions differed extensively, with some language versions talking about audiovisual broadcasting and others about broadcasting. And that created huge problems in our ability as industry to implement that in a way that would strike the right balance. So industry, and again, my personal view, industry was put in a very difficult position where it had to make some difficult choices, and the ask to the European Commission and to other national regulators, actually by trade associations at member state level, because it was not just search engines, it was also telecom providers who were asked to block access to entire sites at the ISP level. There was an ask to be more precise. That ask was addressed, but it does raise the question, which we should be discussing, as to any interpretation by a body that is not the legislator later on, does it have the same value? And in any event, there should be a requirement for transparency. And Google has a policy of always providing Lumen with notifications, legal notices it receives to remove content from search. So we do that, and we did that according to our long-standing practice, but not everybody does that. So that does raise a number of difficult questions for the future.
And you know, our other panelists are more than welcome to comment on this specific controversy. But I might want to jump to Nighat now, because when it comes to the DSA, you're an insider outsider, you could say. You're from Pakistan. You focus on Pakistan, but you're also in the oversight board. So you are used to using international human rights standards as one of the instruments with which to judge Meta's content moderation. But I know that you're also someone, and I also saw you nod when at Agapi's comments, you're also someone who has pointed out that what happens in Brussels does not necessarily stay in Brussels. And this is something that we at the Future Free Speech Project have also documented. We've done a number of reports showing how the Network Enforcement Act, the German NetzDG, has been copy-pasted more or less in a number of other countries, copy-pasted in bad faith, of course, without the same rule of law protections and safeguards that are applicable in Germany, in places like Russia, Belarus, Venezuela, and so on. But nonetheless, that takes some of the ability of European democracies to criticize these with a straight face. It undermines them and empowers illiberal actors. So when you look at what at the current draft of the DSA and all the discussions that are ongoing, what is your perspective in a country where the government is happy to crack down on online free speech and also do it in rather more extensive fashion than what is normal here in Europe?
Yeah, I also need to be very careful what I'm going to say about this while sitting in the same country.
Of course.
Even to talk about content moderation policies or the rules and regulations the government is introducing, even talking about that, can put you in danger. But I agree what Agapi basically said about, and that's something, like I have been, given my work in Pakistan, I have been saying this over and over again, not in recent years, but since I started working on digital rights like a decade ago. That was something, my argument in the Internet Governance Forum, during RightsCon, all these international events where we get together and discuss, all these issues, including content moderation, before it became, like a real big issue. The practices and the policies and the conversations that are taking place and have been taking place in the global north, how those policies and conversations have impacted our part of the world. And to be very honest, to this point, I'm really frustrated because we have cautioned people with whom we have worked with, the policymakers sitting in Brussels, the policymakers sitting in UK, in US, who are talking about all these issues, have been talking about these issues, that you really need to be careful when you talk about regulation, because whatever you do in your part of the world, in global north, where the rule of law is strong, that impacts us, and we are seeing the impact now. There is this online safety bill in UK. Honestly, like the same copy we have here with the name of social media rules in Pakistan. And it's not that the way these policies and regulations, they come in our jurisdictions with proper consultations, with inclusive discussions. No, it doesn't work like that here. It's just like one day you see the news, you read the news in the newspaper, the government is thinking about it, and then after 15 days you see that, oh, the ordinance has been notified by the government, or like some conversations took place with stakeholders, and who these stakeholders are, we don't know. So and the way Agapi also said something about the way regulators see what content is harmful content. That's exactly the way we are seeing the governments in especially in South Asia. I mean, there's like similar kind of version in India. We are seeing the regulation that they are making. The way they see harmful content is like might not be a harmful content in Europe, right? Here the harmful content is even criticizing government actions. And who is interpreting all these definitions? Of course, the people sitting in the regulatory body, the policymakers sitting in the parliament absolutely have no idea what these discussions are. They have no knowledge even how internet works. For some of them, internet is Facebook. Meta is internet for them. So what I'm trying to say is, and this is like a a very broader argument. I don't want to go into nitty-gritty because there are so many regulations that we have seen in Pakistan over the years that just, like slapped on our face, that this is the regulation around social media, this is the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and then, there's some regulations around regulating mainstream media, but has, like element of regulating internet as well. And when you look at those regulations, the way they have been drafted, it actually tells you that who is behind drafting those regulations, right? And where where you see that there is no proper framework around internet governance in countries where the conversations are even not there, where the free speech in the online spaces, the respect of civil liberties in the online spaces are still under discussion. Different stakeholders are exploring this space. Judiciary has no idea how to interpret, like different regulations, but at the same time, how to decide matters. It's pretty complex here. So broadly, I wanted to say is, whatever regulations are in the making, the global north has impact in the global south, and we really need to take an approach where we all are part of the conversation, and there should be, like some universal framework that everyone can look up to, be it the governments in the developing countries or in the Western democracies. But context definitely matters, and keeping in mind what our context is, what our cultural realities are, I think that's also something that not just the regulatory body needs to look into and policymakers, but also social media companies when they are looking into their community guidelines. So I'll end here and then.
All right, thank you, Nighat. Juan, you're someone who have looked at international human rights as relevant, at least to the question of content moderation. It's also something that we at the Future Free Speech Project have done. We've published a report called the Framework of Human Rights as a Framework of First Reference for Content Moderation. But there are, of course, those who are critical of a human rights approach. First of all, these so your Meta, your Google are private companies, and so they can adopt terms, private terms, and they are not bound. Neither Meta nor Google have ratified the ICCPR, and so they're not bound by it. International human rights law applies to states and governments. Plus, there are also tricky categories such as spam and maybe porn categories that may not per se run afoul of international human rights standards, but which you might nonetheless like to have removed. So is human rights law a promising avenue? How can you? Is it something that is worth pursuing?
So first of all, thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon, good evening in my case. Glad to be here. First of all, I would like to kind of underscore some sort of a contrast. This is the time in history when we have more documents, more standards, declarations, resolutions, beyond the international law, legal standards, international instruments, regarding freedom of expression. The United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, all the resolutions by the Council of Europe, etc. But at the same time, probably it's a time when states have decided to renationalize laws and regulations on freedom of expression, saying that there are things that we want to get back, or there are things that we really need to tackle at the national level because they are particularly relevant for us. And this is something like, for example, terrorism. We have seen an enlargement of provisions regarding terrorism and all sorts of incitement, glorification, etc. Hate speech, particularly after Charlie Hebdo, probably. Both in not only in the South, but also in let's say, European states, for example, we have seen the emergence of new laws or new interpretations of the law, both offline and online. Also, the rediscovery of blasphemy laws in Europe, which is something that we've seen in many cases. I mean, blasphemy laws were, by the way, also some of the conclusions of your report were in the books. They had not been used for decades, and all of a sudden, states rediscovered them and decide that they can be useful in order to avoid certain offenses, certain societal problems. So I think that I see this extension of the powers of the state in a time, again, as I said, where we have more international standards than ever, more international documents, also produced by the UN rapporteur, etc. So that is one reflection. The other reflection is that the truth is that there has been an evolution, an incredible evolution to perhaps to analyze in detail when it comes to the community standards by platforms in the course of the last 10 years. I would say that when these big platforms emerged, they had a view of freedom of expression that was perhaps more based on, let's say, the First Amendment and a California way of seeing freedom of expression, but more and more the need to create some sort of to protect the civility of conversations, the need to avoid certain dangers, perhaps the adoption of certain business models. These represented a change, an evolution in the way, community standards were drafted. And also, of course, I would say that pressure coming from regulators, pressure coming from legislators, and particularly, I would say, also from the European Commission, European institutions, pushed, in a way, platforms to introduce more and more, let's say, rules, more, let's say, restrictions, if you wish, in their own community standards, to the point that, now perhaps platforms are between two poles of force. One is platforms are not doing enough, and the other one is platforms are doing too much. And it's probably difficult to kind of find a balance between these two allegations or these two accusations that perhaps come from two different sides or two different parts of the society. But platforms have too much power, or platforms are not doing enough to deal with the risks that we have in a society. And the third idea that I wanted to mention at this point is the very interesting, and this is also related to your question, the sort of convergence between legality and terms of service. And we see that, for example, in the DSA. The DSA, for example, has a provision that, let's say, defines how terms of service shall be. It says they need to be clear, they need to be precise, but not only that, it says that basically terms of service need to respect the right to freedom of expression as protected by international standards. But the DSA doesn't provide any guidance on how to interpret that. And moreover, the new amendments introducing the DSA at some point say, well, if terms of service don't fulfill these requirements, they are not valid. Which, these may trigger also interesting discussions, interesting conflicts on whether, terms of service can be seen as valid or not by users, depending also on the interpretation that we make of the right to freedom of expression. Also, an additional element for discussion when we talk about, terms of service, human rights, etc., is that more and more we see that legislation imposes, and by the way of the online safety bill, imposes on platforms the obligation to introduce in their internal content moderation rules, principles, restrictions that wouldn't be acceptable if included in a law. For example, on the one hand, EU law says you platforms need to respect human rights law, but on the other hand, there are codes of practice that say, well, you need to restrict disinformation, for example, in a way that would not be acceptable if that was established by law. So I think that we see, this sort of contrast between a certain language that says that, of course, freedom of expression, international standards need to be respected by platforms, whatever that means. But on the other hand, also this pressure coming from the government saying they need to go beyond what is illegal, and tackle things that are harmful. And here I can only subscribe what Agapi said about particularly the idea of the systemic risks that need to be assessed and mitigated. I think that the way this is drafted, of course, takes platforms beyond the issue of legality. And of course, this creates a problem, particularly, basically in terms of applying the three-part test. Something as simple as that, and particularly when it comes to legality, the foreseeability of the limitation that, with this kind of provisions, so vague provisions, it's very, very hard to understand that possible restrictions are foreseeable at this point and the way they are established by law. And the last thing that I want to mention is the oversight board experience, which I think is a very interesting exercise of trying to apply international standards to content moderation. So far, the experience is very limited. I've devoted some time to look into the decision of the oversight board. Truth to be said is that they show some degree of consistency when it comes to applying international human rights standards, so that I believe it's worth and interesting taking a look at them. Problem is that, of course, now we still need to see to what extent this is an interesting exercise for, let's say, experts and academia, or the utility of the oversight board goes beyond that, beyond this exercise that is very interesting and really changes the way Meta operates and creates standards that go beyond the specific case, the specific discussion, and are adopted by the platform. And then also the concern about, Article 18 of the DSA and the possible creation of a market of oversight board, so to speak, or competition in the provision of oversight board services, because these also create the risks of possible content cartels or content cartels for content moderation. Certain way of moderating content or overseeing content moderation that becomes dominant in the market. So this is also perhaps a concern that deserves another conversation, but I think this is part of this interesting experiment, again, that I believe the oversight board is. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a good thing that our next speaker is Nilay from Meta. Meta operating, of course, both Facebook and Instagram, and probably the platform, especially Facebook, that has been the most in the firing line by both civil society actors, but certainly governments around the world. But also, I think it's fair to say, has changed its tune when it comes to the relationship between freedom of expression and what should be kept up and what should be removed. There's been some remarkable pivots, I think, from Mark Zuckerberg and the company as such. So, Nilay, you may not necessarily speak authoritatively on behalf of Mr. Zuckerberg today, but perhaps you can give us some insight into how on earth you plan to continue with a strong protection of voice, while at the same time seeking to remove harms, and how do you define these harms, and of course, to what degree can international human rights standards play a role? That is, of course, a big question. Is it possible to basically take the decisions of the oversight board and make them work at scale? Because it's very different to have like a number of experts sit and spend months and studying every detail and taking into account all context, and then having your automated content moderation use it, or your content moderators having perhaps a lot less time to reflect on each content moderation decision. So is this even possible for you guys?
Thank you so much, Jakob, and also thank you so much for this opportunity. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Nilay. I'm in Meta's content policy team. As you all know, Content Policy is our team that is responsible for drafting our policies, our community standards on what should and should not be shared on our platform. Specifically, I work in a team called Content Policy Stakeholder Engagement, and our role is to engage with academics, civil society organizations, and experts to really understand the outside perspectives and expertise, and then bring it into our content policy making process. First of all, I would like to also thank the team and Jakob about the working paper and the global survey. The global survey was really interesting for me to read as well. It was really a rare look to all the different perspectives, and it was a good highlight of the issues that we are facing on a day-to-day basis when we try to make policies. But the very first thing that I noticed, to be perfectly honest with you, was the Turkish people's attitude towards speech that insults the national flag. According to the result, Turkey was at the very end of 33 countries, 16% support to the insult of national flag, which was really interesting for me because I'm Turkish. Before joining Facebook, Meta's content policy team, I was in their public policy team, leading our work in Turkey. And before that, I was a lawyer and a policy consultant working on online speech laws in Turkey. So, and I started working for Meta's issues back in 2008. Back then, like 14 years ago, things were very different. I mean, Turkey was one of the really, I guess, very few countries to regulate speech. We had this law, which many of you know, 5651, that was introduced in 2007. It was bringing requirements to different types of providers, bringing a process actually to block content. And I remember when we even first talked to back then Facebook's lawyers in the US, they were quite surprised about this law that Turkey was bringing, especially from the First Amendment perspective. Of course, a lot has changed over these 14 years. Our Turkish law has become much more detailed, bringing new areas. I stopped working on the Turkish law, and then the German SDG law came, and then Turkey even copied the local representative requirements. So I wanted to just emphasize this from the ripple effect perspective of DSA and other European laws, as many of the panelists have explained here. Another important thing that I noticed in the survey is really the strong universal support for the right to free speech, even in the abstract. I think it's still really important to see that 95% of the people think it's really important that people can say what they want. And this is something that is really important for us when we make our policies. And I really wish this, stays that way. Like there are 5 different values that we consider when we are writing our policies, and giving people a platform for voice is really important. But of course, it is very tough. It's like there are many pressures, as many people mentioned. And also we have responsibilities to make sure people are safe when they use our platforms. And then the other thing is, of course, as stated in the working paper and in the global survey, there is no universal agreement on where to draw the line. And we are, when writing these policies, trying to write these, draw this line in areas like hate speech or offending minorities. And as Jakob mentioned, scale of our platforms is really important here. So we serve 3.3 billion people. It's 40% of the world's population, coming from different backgrounds, cultures, belief systems, as mentioned in the survey and in the working paper. To give you an example, last year we were reviewing a very core area of our hate speech policy. So our hate speech policy protects people or groups of people from attacks against them based on their protected characteristics. This is a core premise of our hate speech policy is that we protect people, not concepts, ideas, or institutions. The aim of this distinction is to permit legitimate discussion and criticism in areas like politics, culture, and ideology. But we were receiving feedback that this distinction may not always provide enough protection for the users. In some cases, the distinction between concept and people might feel thin. In others, where there is particularly close identification with the concept, an attack on the concept may wound as deeply as an attack on the person. So there were various different opinions there. And we consulted quite extensively on this issue. So for some people, speech that was perceived as hurtful was regarded as serving a valuable civic purpose by others. Some stakeholders say my religion is my identity, attacking it is hate speech, it's harmful, while others describe the legitimate role of such speech in advancing public discourse and preserving dissent. So ultimately, we have identified that those attacks not contributing to real world harm is really key, and local context is really key. But there were lots of different views and perspectives. And I think the results of the survey, when I had a look at the results of the survey, especially when it comes to the religion, it reminded me of those consultations and really how different the views were. In addition to the difficulties around making these policies, of course, there is how do you operationalize those policies to apply to billions of content that is shared every day. I think over the course of last few years, especially, there has been quite important work to broaden the capacity to better understand the nuances, to have a bit better nuanced approach when it comes to content moderation. For example, in our site, consulting globally with experts and civil society helps us better understand the context. In addition to that, increasing the capacity of internal resources, especially in different languages, also helps. On the ground partnerships that you build with civil society really helps to understand the nuances in emerging situations, because you make one rule, but you need to really understand the situation on the ground when very fast removing emerging situations happen. And then we also moving away from remove and keep also is another thing that brings nuance to content moderation. So for example, using other tools like putting labels, which is something that is discussed recently as well, for example, for state media, or reducing the distribution of certain types of content, or giving people additional information. I think these are all different types of tools that have been developed over the years to bring more nuance into the content moderation process. And of course, transparency is really important as well. These are some of the things that, you know, we consider and work on the content moderation side of things. Of course, there are many different questions, and I think the survey really shows how difficult this is. Are we at a better place than like 14 years ago? I think in many areas, yes, like we are working on this, experts are working on this, regulators are working on this. I would like to believe that there is progress, but of course, there's a lot of ongoing questions as well. And then lastly, on the conclusions part, and Jakob, you asked this as well, when it comes to international human rights framework, I'm not an expert on international human rights law, so I don't want to like say something that is beyond me. However, I should say that the main principles of international human rights, like necessity, like proportionality, those are things that we really consider for a long time when we craft our policies. Also, being a member of the Global Network Initiative really is important for us. We are engaging very closely with human rights experts. The human rights team is also very much a key part of the policymaking process. When it comes to things like robust plan of action, I think we increasingly, especially when it comes to bringing nuance to our policies, we increasingly use the notions in the robust plan of action. There are some difficulties, again, coming with the scale. Like, for example, when it comes to intent of the speaker, how do you How do you identify this at the scale that we are operating in? But I think overall, increasingly, international human rights is becoming more and more a focus of the work that we do. Maybe I stop here. I wanted to provide some,
but let's pick up on them in the next round, because I want to get Rikke in now. Rikke, like me, you're from Denmark. We're sort of normally seen as one of the most progressive liberal societies in the world. But it's fair to say that in the past years, our government as well has been suspicious of free speech, and there's a draft bill on its way through Parliament. Even though the DSA is in the works, we have a draft bill which says that that relevant platforms, I think that have 100,000 users or something, should remove illegal content within 24 hours from the outset, and then in special circumstances a week, and then very special circumstances 2 weeks. But it's interesting. So at Justitia we did this. We did a survey where we looked at a representative sample of Facebook comments from politicians and Danish media outlets, Facebook sites, and I think we went through 2,500 comments that had been labeled as hate speech based on an algorithm that was based on Facebook's own definition. But we only found that 11 of those 2,500 comments violated Danish law when it came to hate speech, incitement to terrorism, and so on. And so, if that is a representative sample, it would be something like 0.006% of all comments, or 1 out of 15,000 comments that actually violated Danish law. So is that an illustration that even in a democracy like Denmark, governments are going too far and they're not looking at it sufficiently nuanced, or is the fact that there are illegal comments, that not all illegal comments are being removed, is that a good reason to legislate in the manner that the Danish government is proposing? What's your take on that?
Thank you very much, Jacob, and hello everyone. Happy to be here. As Jacob said, I'm Rikke from Jørgensen. I'm a researcher at the Danish Human Rights Institute, so that's Denmark's national human rights institution. And I've worked on the intersection of technology and human rights from before people even thought it was a topic. From back when you really had to explain why technology was somehow linked to human rights. Whereas today, people are just nodding their head off wildly, and everyone can see that, of course, there is interconnection between technology and most human rights we can think of. So I was thinking when preparing for this afternoon, the topic of today, free speech and content moderation, even though that I and my institution have worked on it for a long time, I still think that it's just a hugely complicated topic. And I was trying to think, why is it so difficult still to grasp, also when you're trying to explain it to, for example, the Danish government and the regulators here. So I'll try just to sketch out some of the reasons why I think this is really tricky and how we should approach it from a human rights perspective. So my first point is that, as illustrated by the study of Justitia on attitudes towards freedom of expression, there's a great discrepancy between a general abstract commitment to freedom of expression and then the concrete attitudes towards specific types of expression, for example, offensive speech. So in practice, many, also regulators, expect social media companies to moderate content beyond what freedom of expression standards would prescribe. That's the case in Denmark, and that's also the case elsewhere. So currently, the companies, as I see it, are in a situation where they have to negotiate a lot of different interests from shareholders, advertisers, governments, civil society groups, users. And they do apply their own standards for content moderation based on the terms that they come up with, a sort of a middle ground between all these different expectations. And as was said earlier, there are many who think they do too little, and there are many that think they do too much. And the terms, of course, they change regularly, and their compliance with international freedom of expression standards are not systematically assessed or documented. I mean, we're moving in that direction and we're talking more about it, but it still remains, I think, to be seen as a systematic practice. So that's like one element of the complexity. Second, I think there is this very blurred mix between expectations on the companies with regard to unlawful content, which is expected to come down as fast as possible, and which is also the main topic of the EU's DSA, and then lawful content, which is supposed to stay up. And so far, I think when you look at it globally, and particularly in Europe, most attention has been directed towards the company's role in removing unlawful content. So in Denmark, as Jakob just mentioned, we have this new law that is modeled after the German NetzDG, but I mean goes further than the German law in requiring companies to act quickly to remove all types of unlawful content and provide for penalty if companies fail to do so. So we have time limits and we have sanctions. So this piece of regulation delegates an enormous amount of freedom of expression decisions to these private companies with penalties and with timelines. And under such conditions, the risk of removing lawful content is just substantial. Then if we look at the other side of the coin, the desire to keep lawful content online, then there are currently not many safeguards to ensure this. As was mentioned, it's been introduced in the DSA now that that companies should look towards freedom of expression standards when they design their terms of service, but it's not really. I mean, it's very vague how that should be in practice. And so far, and that is at least the approach in Denmark so far, as private companies, the platforms are free to define and enforce their terms, and they do so with great variation across the different platforms. So we have de facto a situation where we have content moderation practices that greatly impact on citizens' rights, but is exercised without human rights safeguards in place. So for my final remarks, I'll try to suggest some of the safeguards that we could actually install in order to make content moderation more human rights compliant. The first thing we could do was to make sure that company practices for content regulation are grounded in human rights law. And here I would refer to the criteria found in CCPR Article 19, the three-party test that has already been mentioned of legality, legitimate aim, and necessity, but also in Article 20 standards in relation to hate speech. You all know that the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Justitia, and many scholars have actually already at this point in time elaborated how these human rights standards could guide company policy and practice. And I mean, I was just, when preparing for this, looking again over your report, Jakob, on the framework of first reference report. And I think there you actually find some very concrete guidance on how that could be done. Second, I think it's important that we have the companies document how they use human rights standards as benchmark for the content moderation practice. So we need documentation on how it's being applied in practice. And we need, of course, also reporting obligations so that this documentation of how human rights standards are the baseline for content moderation, that's also reported upon so that we can have a public discussion about it. And finally, I think that independent oversight and complaint mechanisms should be established at national level, including the possibility of judicial review of some of the decisions taken. And I'm fully aware that that would, of course, not be feasible on all decisions. That's simply not possible at the scale we're talking about. But I think in some principal cases, it's important that we actually have the ability to have a review of whether the way that these regulations such as the DSA are being implemented, whether they go too far and to what extent they actually take down too much lawful content, and also the other way around, fail to remove illegal content. So I think I will stop here with these initial remarks.
Okay, great. That means that we have made it to our last, but certainly not least, panelists, Professor Tarlach McGonagle from the University of Amsterdam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really feeling the pressure here. You opened this panel by announcing and promising that the panel was going to provide solutions. I've heard lots of really excellent points that reinforce the complexity and the multidimensionality of all this, but I haven't heard a solution yet. And I'm the last speaker, and I'm feeling
that's why we have the professor at the end.
Well, lawyers are good at disclaimers. I'm down with COVID at the moment. I'm tired and fuzzy. If some of my sentences are joined up, I'll be really happy. More seriously, though, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an excellent panel and an excellent audience. I'll make a few modest contributions. First of all, I would like to commend Justitia in particular for the framework of first reference report. I think there's an awful lot of food for thought in there. There's been some discussion in the panel about how central human rights should be in the approaches that companies take to content moderation, and how easily translatable and workable these standards would be. Look, here's a joke or a problem to start off with. The two topics that we've been discussing most today in this panel, hate speech and disinformation, neither of them, you won't find either of them in international human rights treaty law. They have emerged as convenient catch-all terms for certain categories of expression, and then the big challenge for lawyers and everybody working with these concepts is to give them meaning and to position them within the frameworks that are set out in treaties and developed in political instruments around those treaties. So this is a huge ask to start off with. So I think the call that you make in your study for international human rights law to be the first framework of first reference is very important. And there is a strong focus in that report on Article 19 and 20 ICCPR, which Rikke recalled just a moment ago. That's very important. But, I think we've reached a point as an international human rights community, partly for the reasons that Juan mentioned a few minutes ago, new emerging problems for freedom of expression on top of the old enduring problems. I think we've got to the point where we've just got to demand more action in terms of what the international human rights framework offers. And I think this is a good start. I would also, seeing as you've been bold enough to take this first step, I would encourage you and invite you and exhort you to be even more bold and to look, however important and central they are, to look beyond Articles 19 and 20 ICCPR and be aware of the full constellation of other international human rights instruments that can be very important for a more systematic embracing of human rights in the activities of big tech companies, as Rikke called for a moment ago. And I think it's very important to have the basic international human rights standards as your first point of reference. But once you get into the additional level of complexity that so many fellow panelists have mentioned already, then you will have added value from the more specific focuses of the additional international treaties. And I think one thing that we shouldn't forget is that however important it is to draw lines and to draw red lines in content moderation, that's only one part of the what the international human rights framework has to offer. There's an awful lot that can be achieved, including, and perhaps in particular, by big tech companies when it comes to reaching out to communities, providing information, awareness raising, opportunities for counter speech. I see Susan Benish is in the audience there, a leading expert on this issue. There's an awful lot that can be done in terms of empowerment and education and information and awareness raising. And this is one of my criticisms of existing mechanisms that we have, such as at the European level, the Code of Conduct on Countering Illegal Hate Speech Online. There is rightly a lot of attention for statistics about notification and removal. But if you read through that document, you will see that further down, relegated perhaps, I hope not, further down in that document, there are other commitments about reaching out to communities, etc. I would like to see a lot more uptake of those commitments. And as Rikke called for just a moment ago, proactive reporting, documentation on what is being done in those regards. I also see a lot of lip service to freedom of expression in existing mechanisms, whether it's the DSA, the Code of Conduct, or the Code of Practice on Disinformation. I'd like to see more meaningful engagement with freedom of expression. And meaningful engagement with freedom of expression isn't just about scrutinizing the limits. It's about looking at more positive obligations that flow from states' international commitments to freedom of expression. What measures can be done to ensure more pluralism, to ensure enhanced media and information literacy? And again, very grateful to Rikke. She's done so much preparatory work for me. The safeguards that you itemized are really, really crucial. So maybe to wrap up then, and seeing as you put us under so much pressure, Jakob, by asking for solutions, I'll put you under pressure now again. Maybe in the further development of this approach of a framework of first reference, maybe you could boldly go towards a framework of constant reference. So not just settle for international human rights law being the alpha of policies relating to content online, but that it would be the alpha and the omega of policies relating to content moderation online. I say all this, and maybe just the final remark is, we've got lots of emerging political standards about human rights responsibilities of business, and including big tech companies. I think, and there's been a lot of traction for these commitments. I think it's really time to put more steel into human rights due diligence and impact assessment commitments, and see where that takes us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tarlach. If that's the level you operate on when you're struck with COVID, I want the strain of COVID that you're suffering from. Thank you very much.
You can have it immediately. I don't want it anymore.
Time, obviously, when you have as brilliant a panel as this, time is running away. We only have 20 minutes or so left. If you have questions, please send them. Natalie, what's the way to do it best for questions?
Up to you, maybe in the chat, or
in the post questions in the chat. One of and then we'll try to get them together. And I asked the panelists, of course, to be very, very brief, since we only have 20 minutes or so left. One issue that we also touch a bit upon in the framework of first reference, and one that we at Justitia are looking into from a more sort of technological point of approach, is maybe a more decentralized approach to content moderation. And I would love to get the panelists' thoughts on that, because say that a number of studies, for instance, have shown that women who are prominent in the public debate, politicians, feel a disincentive to participate on social media because they are being met with misogynistic abuse. And some of that might not reach the threshold that international human rights law would demand for content removal. But if you could have, say, someone who was not Facebook, who was not Twitter, who was not YouTube, who developed a filter to basically purge misogyny, online misogyny, and that at the user level you could basically flick it on and off, might that be a way to give users more control over the content that they want to be confronted with, and then avoid the dangers of centralized, platformized content moderation? So this is something that at least we'll be working with and see if we can develop some kind of better type. But I'd love to get your perspectives on whether this is something that can be useful in addition to human rights standards. But yeah, that could be sort of the first question. And Juan, I see you you have raised your hand, so please take the floor, Juan.
Yeah, thank you. Just two things. The first one is that I believe that decentralization does not only help to, let's say, better accommodate the needs or the rights of the speaker, but it's also good in terms of avoiding that the establishment of excessive obligations when it comes to content moderation introduces entry barriers to the market, so that only big platforms can comply with certain obligations when it comes to content moderation, because they are so complex, so sophisticated in terms of what they need, the instruments that they need to put in place, that, it becomes very difficult for small, medium platforms to enter the market, unless we have this gradual approach, of course, but still. That's one thing. The other thing is that I would like to make things a little bit more complicated, if I may. Talking about the framework of second reference, which is administrative law. I come from the field originally as a professor. I started my career as professor of administrative law, and I realized that some of the discussions that now we're currently having when it comes to transparency, due process, motivation, etc., statement of reasons, could be solved if we use the categories, the traditional categories that due process has been already incorporated into the traditional administrative law and the relationship between the citizen and the administration. So, and there's a very interesting article by Evelyn Bueck talking a little bit about this, and I think that this is an area that needs to be explored. Human rights is a first reference, can be an interesting first reference, but also, let's say that traditional safeguards, procedural, transparent safeguard, statement of reasons that we find in administrative law and regulation may also be useful to solve certain issues that we may find in the relationship between the user and the platform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. I see that Gavin Phillipson has raised his hand. So Gavin, please, love to have your input.
Thanks, Jacob. Well, yes, just refer to the first layer of protection that John was just mentioning. In other words, international human rights law. My question is whether the panel, or how the panel regards the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which we would hope, at least for Europe, would be the kind of primary source of standards, along perhaps with Court of Justice, although I think on the whole Strasbourg's a bit better than the Court of Justice of the European Union on this. But unfortunately, in the area, particularly the area which the survey highlighted, religiously offensive speech, but I'd also add actually glorification of terrorism and others, I think the Strasbourg, personally, the case law is not either rigorous or reliable in upholding freedom of expression, and hasn't been ever since the decision in Otto Preminger, which was, I think, possibly even worse in the more recent case of ES and Austria. I think, in fact, Strasbourg has legitimized the de facto revival of blasphemy laws in Western Europe and other states, which is, if anything, a regressive step. So I wondered if anyone had any comments on using Strasbourg essentially in this area.
That's a very, I don't know if we have anyone who would be interested in replying to that. Natalie and I can say, have recently published an article which compares the European Court of Human Rights case law on hate speech with that of the upper courts in South Africa, and we find that the South African courts tend to be more speech protective than the Strasbourg court. And I would imagine that if you compared the Human Rights Committee with the European Court of Human Rights, you would also see a more speech protective approach when it comes to a category like hate speech from the Human Rights Committee. But Tarlach, you're here to set the record straight.
No, but your own article that you just referenced, I thought was very, very useful article. Thanks for that, Gavin. I know your earlier work on these issues, so I don't need to. You're asking this question for a reason. It's a real sore point in the court's jurisprudence, and it remains a real point of friction and tension and criticism. My reading of it, there are others in the audience, like Dirk there, who would probably be happy to jump in. But my reading of it is, that this remains a very problematic area of case law, particularly because of the way that the margin of appreciation doctrine is being used. I take some hope from some of the dissenting opinions that they may, in the fullness of time, be heeded and lead to a bit of a turnaround in the discourse of the case law since Otto Preminger. But for the moment, it looks like it's remaining problematic.
I don't know, Dirk. Would you be have comments on this? As someone who has thought about this for a number of years.
Well, because you asked, Jacob, and because Tarlach played the ball in my direction, when you say that the South African Supreme Court has has an approach which is more protective for free speech, which means the European Court is less protective for free speech. When we talk about hate speech, I don't consider that necessarily as a bad thing. I think hate speech is an enormous problem in our societies. So when there is a court which tends to see the problems with regard to hate speech and tries to tackle that and to use the three-step test in order to justify restriction sanctions with regard to criminal incitement to violence, discrimination, or hatred, with a clear intention and with the risk of imminent danger, then I think this is a contribution to the central values in a democracy. So I leave aside whether the European Court is doing that in a consistent way. And just by making this nuance means that I can see that there are some inconsistencies in some of the judgment and the decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, and that can absolutely be improved. I think some judgments on hate speech really reflect the many different conditions that should be fulfilled before you can justify that an intervention is necessary. But in some of the decisions and the judgments, I think with also the margin of appreciation where Tarlach is referring to, the court leaves a bit too wide possibility to member states to interfere on this issue. And I would also make a very severe remark with regard to the application of Article 17, the so-called abuse clause or anti-totalitarian clause, which has been used in some of the decisions by the European Court. I think that is a very dangerous tool to say that some of the applicants cannot rely on Article 17 because what they are doing is against the values of the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think this is a very vague and subjective way of excluding the rights of applicants when they feel that there has been a too broad interference with regarding to their political freedom of expression. And I think although the court said that Article 17 can only be used in extreme and very exceptional cases, it has applied Article 17 in some of these cases, and I would suggest that that would not be the case anymore, and that they do the full 3-step test with all the elements necessary in order to justify where it's necessary to interfere with hate speech. So maybe I have a position here which concerns that our democracies need to react against hate speech more than maybe many of the other people here in participating in the group, and certainly a bigger awareness in Europe than, for instance, in the United States, where we know that the First Amendment gives very little room to interfere with what we call criminal hate speech in Europe. If that can help.
Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful, Dirk. Of course, just to round it off, of course, the South African model is also, I mean, they have certain experiences with racist hate speech as well. And it's very interesting to see how the European Court of Human Rights sees free speech in history, and how the South African courts view free speech. So that there's more of a tendency for the European Court of Human Rights to argue that free speech leads or is dangerous, whereas the South African court says that, well, restrictions on free speech might be even more dangerous. But I would love to give the floor to Susan Benesch. Maybe you've done wonderful work. I'm sure most people here are familiar with it, with the Dangerous Speech Project, and maybe you can also enlighten us a bit about the potential of counter speech, because and whatever other perspective you have on this discussion. So Susan, please.
Thank you. First of all, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to listen to all of you. It's a terrific meeting with a wonderful bunch of people. You may have seen me grinning and shaking my head and so forth during the discussion of the case law. Those of you who have maybe heard me talking before have undoubtedly already heard me complaining about the wide variation in understandings of hate speech and what it is. And I'm going to offer one idea to kind of cut through all of that underbrush after reminding us that the platforms purport to regulate with one standard for the whole world. Meta is maybe most famous for insisting on that, for repeatedly claiming that they have one set of so-called community standards for the 2.2 billion people they are therefore implicitly construing as a community, which is preposterous, of course. And it shouldn't surprise us that different societies have given rise to different sets of laws for regulating speech. It is exactly as it should be, in my view. Society, after all, law is a kind of symptom of social and historical process. So it's really a conundrum, in my view, even in cases unlike that of the European law, where courts do agree with themselves, where the standards are not so confusing. They don't agree with each other from one country to the next. So I have a little idea that can be perhaps useful, and that is, instead of trying to regulate content and protect freedom of expression, which in my view is enormously important, always to keep in mind and do at the same time, exclusively by focusing on the content itself. It can be very useful for platforms and those of us who think about what they ought to do and how to get them to do it better, also to focus on specifically on the types of damage or harm that the regulation is designed to prevent or diminish. There are numerous forms of content that can bring about very different, very distinct harms. And platforms and policymakers must decide that they are trying to prevent certain harms and, frankly, not trying so hard to prevent other harms, such as offense or emotional damage. This is difficult to discuss and even more difficult to declare publicly. But the platforms will be able to regulate more consistently and more usefully once they focus on for themselves internally. And then also, I think this must be disclosed publicly, which harms they are prioritizing and which ones they are not prioritizing comparatively. So that's one idea that I hope can be useful, and it's quite interesting also to look at the jurisprudence in that light. The most obvious harm is the one that I focus on most in my work, which is violence, physical violence between groups of people. There are, of course, many other sorts of harms. I won't take up time to list them, but believe me, that's an interesting and I think useful exercise. And then, Jakob, you asked about counter speech. With my colleagues, I have spent some very interesting and even somewhat encouraging time looking at ways in which individuals and considerably large groups in civil society are systematically responding to what they regard as hate speech online. It turns out that there are more than 100,000 people doing this regularly in various groups. That bears study for serious, rigorous study to see what kind of effects they're having. After all, you know, we've been talking about counterspeech since 1927 at least, when Justice Louis Brandeis touted it in a U.S. Supreme Court case, but Brandeis didn't provide any evidence that it is effective. He didn't have any, and he didn't have anywhere near the means to gather such evidence that we have now. In the midst of all the moral panic about the internet and how awful it is, it's worth remembering that there are certain things that are good about it, including that it provides a spectacular opportunity to study what are the effects of humans communicating with one another. There's no question, of course, and with this I'll finally stop. There's no question that humans do things mainly because other people have spoken to them in ways that have convinced them to do things. Just think about that for a second. Everything you do is, or nearly everything you do is because of what you've heard or read from some other people. So all of these things really need rigorous study. And for that reason, I'm just starting up with some other researchers, a new coalition to push the tech companies to share data in responsible, ethical ways for serious study. And of course, such efforts are already well underway in Europe. We Americans are catching up to something that unfortunately is not unusual.
Rikke, you can have 1 minute for your final comments, and then we'll wrap up. But you're the only one who has a raised hand, so the final comments are yours.
Okay, I'll make it really brief. And in response to something that was said earlier, Joan, you mentioned the principles of administrative law as a second reference point, and that speaks into something that I've also thought a lot about, namely how we can harden human rights due diligence principles so that we move from this rather general level where we're discussing it at the moment and giving them something that's more measurable, also in terms of evaluating whether they're actually being followed. And then in response to Susan, I think it's really important that we think about, like you do, other measures than only the legal measures to challenge some of the real problems, like women keeping away from online debates because they are being harassed, whether it's counter speech, whether it's decentralized filters, as Jakob mentioned, but that we are very aware that these are also very valid and real freedom of expression issues, that we have large groups of the population that actually refrain from using these platforms because of what's going on there. And we need to be able to talk about such measures without it turning into legal censorship measures. So we need to be able to frame it in these spaces and have those type of solutions brought into the debate as well.
Thank you, Rikke, and thank you to our panelists and to all those who logged on and listened and contributed to this panel. I hope you found it worthwhile. I also hope that that we may return to you for your expertise as we try to work on this issue going forward. The more minds working together on this, I think, the better. I don't think any single person or any single group of persons will have all the necessary knowledge to come up with practical solutions to this huge issue. So cooperation will be the name of the game, and so we very much hope that you will be interested in working with us going forward. But thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to staying in touch with you going forward.